So let me just give you one piece of data, right? 1960, when I was born, right? The birth rate was still six children per woman, right? And at 0.72, I just told you, there was the rate in 2023. So at 0.72, if 2.1 is what's required to replace the population, the births in Korea are 1/3 of what's required to replace the population. And in Seoul, it's even lower. It's not 0.72, it's 0.55. So just to, at a birth rate of 0.72, right? Just to make it very clear, 100 Koreans today will give birth to 36 children. Those 36 children will grow up, become adults, and they will give birth to 13 children. Those 13 children will grow up and give birth to 5 children. So 100 people today are going to be replaced by 5 people in just 4 generations, right? So this means that 16 million Koreans will disappear. And in terms of the age of its population, again, will be the highest in history. Half the population will be over the age of 65. Less than 10% will be under 25. And children under 5 will make up 1% of the population. Then you have to ask the question, so how can Korea increase its birth rate? And of course, you can't force Korean women to have children. And there are a lot of incentives now. And I think the monthly stipend or direct benefit from having a child went up from, I think it was 40만 원 to 80만 원, something like that. It was increased, and there was a tiny increase in the birth rate. But unfortunately, the experience is that those kind of direct subsidies for women to have children haven't really worked very well anywhere in the world. So if we're serious about tackling this issue, I think what we have to do is, first of all, really try to understand the situation in Korea. There's a lot of interesting research. There are very brilliant Korean scholars who are working on this already. But we have to gather the data that we already have, and we have to especially do different kinds of research to get even more information. Interesting things are already happening. So in one survey, 26% of unmarried women respondents in Korea said that they would consider having a child without getting married. This means that as the number of unmarried women increases, the number of voluntary single mothers is also growing. And of course, an example is the celebrity Sayuri. So Sayuri had a child, and the sperm donor came from Japan. Sorry, is it okay to talk about sperm in 어쩌다 어른?
I'm okay.
뭐 의학적 용어니까.
그렇죠, 그렇죠.
Because we're 어른이니까. And so you might ask, why would the sperm donor come from Japan? Part of it is that Korea's laws are still very restrictive. If a woman wants to get a sperm donation, they have to have a husband. And it goes even further than that, either a husband or a common law partner. And the partner, the male partner, has to have some kind of disease or problem so that their sperm is not viable.
아, 결격 사유가 있어야 되는구나.
But in most of the rest of the world, including Japan, it's much easier to get access to sperm donations. Well, Japan for 25 years has been working very hard on increasing their birth rate. So in Japan, one of the things they did to increase the birth rate was they made paternal and maternal leave much easier, right? They instituted lots more support for new mothers, right? And Prime Minister Kishida was the foreign minister when I was visiting Japan very frequently. And Prime Minister Kishida said, okay, we have done everything that you can possibly do. We now look like Norway or Sweden in terms of our social support. So please don't tell me to do more, because I don't know of anything more we could do. And in 2023, Japan's birth rate was almost double Korea's birth rate. Right?
Wow.
Now, China, their birth rate is still over 1, right? But remember the one-child policy? Now it's the 3-child policy, right? They're actively encouraging, but they've also looked very carefully at how to increase the birth rate. So what they've done is take on something called the hukou system, right? So in China, it used to be that if you were not legally married, it was almost impossible to register a child under the hukou system. And the hukou system is what gives you the right to have education, health care, and services, right? So now a woman, no matter how they have the child, through a surrogate, through adoption, no matter how they have the child, in most provinces, they can register the child and the child will have access to education, health care, and everything. So, immediately they have done something that has led to many new stories about people. There's a very famous economist, a friend of mine, who had 3 children, one by adoption, one by surrogacy, one with a partner, right? And now the stories are everywhere. So everything's changed, right? This has been a very interesting development for China. So. We really have to develop a much deeper and broader knowledge of what's going on in Korea, but also all the innovations that are happening all over the world. And I think, first of all, we're going to need very strong leadership from government officials, but also the private sector. I don't know if it's exactly what should be done, something like it. Patient after patient after patient that was suffering from drug-resistant tuberculosis. I told you a little bit about it earlier. And these are people with tuberculosis in which the tuberculosis bacterium is resistant to the most powerful drugs, right? So the World Health Organization had officially declared that they're not treatable. And so they literally, World Health Organization had declared a death sentence on every person in a poor country that suffered from this disease. So we thought, hey, this is our chance. Maybe we can do something on a much bigger level. So we started treating the patients. That's when we had to borrow $100,000 worth of drugs from Brigham and Women's Hospital. And we started having success. These patients that they said were uncurable, we started getting cures, and we reached 85% cure.
와, 선구자시네.
So this group of patients that WHO had said are untreatable, the Pan American Health Organization, the World Health Organization both said, do not treat them. Do not treat them because they're untreatable. They said the drugs are too expensive. You cannot treat MDR-TB. What are you accusing us of? So it was a fight. We had to fight. So we did everything from lowering the drug prices. So doing a few quick things that I'd learned from being in Korea studying the 약국s. And we lowered the drug prices for the MDR-TB. We lowered the price of the drugs by 90%. We started, and we treated 50 cases in one town of 100,000 people. That ended up changing the world.
We have a clip to play for you.
Fue una lucha en la que fue bien dura. Que
That's milky
tanto de personas que realmente estuvieron ahí.
This is what a transformation, my God. To think we almost let him die.
That was so interesting. We thought, oh my God, this tiny group of people in this tiny organization, we can change the world. So I never stopped doing that. All the other titles were temporary, but that has stayed with me until today. And so just like MDR-TB, there was an issue that was boiling over, and that was treating HIV in developing countries. So this is Joseph Jun. He was about his mid-20s at the time, from an extremely poor part of Haiti. He came to the clinic suffering from both tuberculosis and HIV. But we had gotten donations of antiretroviral drugs, of anti-HIV drugs. And so we started treating him in a period of about 3 months. this is what he looked like.
와, 헬시해졌어. 건강해졌습니다.
So we call this the Lazarus effect of HIV treatment. And the people who were actually living with HIV were mostly in Africa. 25 million people living with HIV in Africa. And we almost couldn't believe it because the HIV doctors were saying exactly the same thing as the TB doctors. It's not possible, it's crazy, the drugs are too expensive, don't even think about treating HIV in developing countries. Once again, they were saying the drugs are too expensive, and at that time, the drugs cost $12,000 per person per year. But that's because they were on patent. And again, I had studied the pharmaceutical industry, so I knew that we could get them off patent, right? We could, and so the argument I made was, so the pharmaceutical industry only makes 1% of its profit in Africa, right? So why are you stopping us from making generic versions of these drugs? Why are you stopping us from doing that? And so they literally wanted to get me fired because I was trying to break patents. And I said, no, I'm not trying to break patents. I just want to figure out a way that we can get the same drugs in generic version to Africa because 25 million people are dying. So Paul Farmer, who I told you about, took those before and after pictures to the White House. Took them to the White House, showed them to George W. Bush's top aides, and that evening, January 28, 2003, George Bush announced, partly based on seeing Joseph Jun's pictures, that he was going to treat HIV.
I asked the Congress to commit $15 billion over the next 5 years, including nearly $10 billion in new money, to turn the tide against AIDS in the most afflicted nations of Africa and the Caribbean.
Now, so interesting, I became head of the HIV department and I set a goal. When we started at WHO in July of 2003, there were about 100,000 people in the world in developing countries getting care. So I said, let's just change the game. Let's treat 3 million people by 2005. So 2.5 years, 3 million people, that's almost impossible because we had to bring the drug prices down. And guess what? We brought the prices from $12,000 per person per year to $70 per person per year. So that eventually the US, but all the other countries, bought these drugs for $70 per person per year. Today, 27 million people in Africa are on treatment. You don't know if something's going to happen. When we were running Partners in Health, we were working in Haiti and Peru and Mexico, some very poor communities. One student asked me, so I think you guys are crazy. You go into these incredibly difficult situations and you always talk about how optimistic you are, right? And it just doesn't make any sense. Because I go there and I don't feel optimistic when I see these situations of great poverty. And so at that moment, just sort of off the top of my head, if you go into these very poor situations and walk around saying, oh God, you can't do anything here, they're so, they're in such bad shape, there's nothing we can do. If that's your attitude, that's the outcome.
우울증.
So 36.8% of people in Korea are thought to be depressed. So there's been tremendous growth, as we know, but this is really disturbing. Highest expected rate of depression in the entire OECD. So what's to blame? So Jonathan Haidt says that the front-facing camera, because of social media, and high-speed internet access, if you put those together, anxiety and depression among young people goes up. So once again, Korea is the highest social media usage. And Korea at 89.3% is about 1.7 times that of other countries. So we know that the use of social media and anxiety and depression are linked, and Korea is one of the most difficult situations in the world. Right? So another thing that you ask, okay, so 36.8% of all Koreans have depression. How many of them get treated? Only 2% of Korean people get access to antidepressive therapy. So again, this shouldn't surprise us that suicide rates are high. If the highest rate of depression and lowest rate of treatment, there really is the lowest rate of treatment in OECD. Loneliness, we know that so-called 고독사, right? 고독사 is higher in Korea than anywhere else. One of my former students was the Surgeon General, the top doctor in the United States, and he said, if you answer yes on a questionnaire when they ask you, are you lonely? It shortens your life the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So it has a direct effect. Anxiety and loneliness have so much to do with suffering, and it's an entirely treatable phenomenon. And the only way to fix it is for the Korean people to demand that it gets fixed. Right? In the US, you see a lot of celebrities talking about depression. You know, Dwayne Johnson said depression doesn't discriminate, it affects everybody. Lady Gaga also said that she suffered from depression her entire life, founded a nonprofit. The British actress Emma Thompson also said depression is really common, it's something that we should all think about. And I had the great good fortune of meeting the BTS guys, and I was on a panel with them at the UN, and RM gave a beautiful speech about how people should love themselves.
I have come to love myself for who I am, for who I was, and for who I hope to become. What is your name? Speak yourself. Thank you very much.
It wasn't specifically about depression, not specifically about suicide, but it was wonderful. So there's the possibility that we can talk about this more effectively. A story about a friend of mine. His name is Kevin Hines, and he's a very famous person because he's one of the few people to jump off the Golden Gate Bridge, you know, in San Francisco, one of the highest bridges. He jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge, and he wasn't either killed or paralyzed. There are only about 3 or 4 people in history who've jumped and were not killed or paralyzed. So Kevin is still there, and he still struggles. But here's what he told me that was just so powerful. He said that before he jumped, he was walking back and forth on the bridge for 45 minutes, looking very distressed, right? And there were many people that walked by him and saw him. And he said that if one person had asked him, "How are you doing?" he wouldn't have jumped. And the other thing he says that's crazy is he says that when he jumped off the bridge, he thought he had endless problems. His problems were unsolvable. But he said the minute his hand came off the bridge, all the solutions to his problems came into his head. And he thought, what an idiot. Why did you do that? And he says many survivors of suicide say the same thing. When they actually take the action, they go, oh my God, what am I doing? When I was in my hometown, Muscatine, Iowa, one of the things that one of the mothers who lost a child told me and told the entire audience, she said, you know, I just want you to know that my daughter did not want to die. She just wanted the pain to end, right? She said, I don't believe she wanted to die. I don't believe she wanted to leave us. I believe she wanted to make the pain end. And so this is why it's so important to train people in seeing what's going on with others. There are some things that are happening out there in the world that are very encouraging, but then there are also things about Korea. My understanding is that the percentage of the health